Hare Krishna. Please accept my humble obeisance of Lord Prabhupada. So we will now resume our discussion from the 5th chapter, verse 22. So last time we finished on verse 21 with Krishna glorifying the situation of one who is at the state of Atmagyan and furthermore at the state of Paramatma Gyan. Right? So he says how Atmagyan makes one free of the dualities of misery that is accompanying material existence, and Paramatma Gyan gives one a sense of happiness by developing a relationship with the form of Krishna. We will now resume from verse 22. ये हि संस्पर्शजा भोगा दुःखयोनयैव ते आद्यन्तवन्त कौन्तेया न तेषु रमते बुधः. An intelligent person does not take part in the sources of misery which are due to contact with the material senses. O son of Kunti, such pleasures have a beginning and an end, and so the wise man does not delight in them. So the verse essentially is building on the previous verse where Krishna had implicitly condemned material pleasure. So he compared material and spiritual, and he had said spiritual is good and implicitly material is not. Here Krishna explicitly condemns material pleasure. Now one might think that this is a nihilistic kind of an attitude, a fatalistic attitude, where one that is the source of happiness is being condemned. So Krishna gives three reasons why he is condemning, to show that this is not just something that is whimsical, but there's a factual basis for it. So first he says that this is coming out from the senses contacting the objects. Right? So he says, ye he means certainly, no doubt about it, samparsaja bhoga, that it is essentially coming from the contact of the senses with the objects, which means that this is external. Right? So the understanding is that if you're dependent on something else, then if that something else changes, it's beyond your control. So it's a tenuous situation to be in. Right? So you go and you say that my happiness is dependent on my neighbor, and the neighbor is acting whimsically. There's one day you may be happy, the other day you may be unhappy. As long as you keep on that position that I'm dependent on my neighbor, your happiness is not in your control, right? So the first point Krishna makes is that essentially you're having somebody else take responsibility for your happiness. Second, he says is that it has a beginning and a end. Right? He says adya antavanta kaunteya, which means that even given that you're depending on somebody else, even that happiness is temporary. It has a beginning and an end. So if it was eternal happiness, if I was dependent on my neighbor and that dependency resulted in me being always happy, then there would be no problem. But the matter of fact is that that situation itself is fraught. It starts, it lasts for some time, and then it ends. So now one might say, okay, but even then, between the beginning and the end, there is some happiness. So Krishna says that it ultimately results in misery, right? So he says that dukkha yonaya evate. So yonaya means birth, that ultimately it gives birth to misery. So even that happiness that you're temporarily experiencing is ultimately a cause of misery. Now, empirically, all of this can be confirmed, right? We have long experience trying to engage with the material world and enjoy, and we know that it is external to us, it's not in our control, it's temporary, and what we think is happiness now is ultimately resulting in misery. Somebody gets wealth, they get happy, and then they're miserable when the wealth is taken away, or they're working hard to hold on to that wealth. So all the situations that are giving temporary happiness, ultimately they have one destination, which is misery. So Prabhupada says that the true yogis or the learned transcendentalists are not attracted by sense pleasures, which are the cause of continuous material existence. The more one is addicted to material pleasures, the more he is entrapped by material miseries. So one may question now that if one gives up all these material pleasures, what is the situation of such a person? Right? That verse, the question Krishna answers in the next verse. Okay, verse 23. Shaknoti heva yahashodam praksharira vimokshana kam krodha bhavam vegam sayukta sa sukhi naraha. Before giving up this present body, if one is able to tolerate the urges of the material senses and check the force of desire and anger, he is well situated and is happy in this world. So this verse answers the implicit question that if everything in this material world is a source of misery, then even the aspiring transcendentalist would be expected to live a miserable life. And Krishna says no. So he gives two instructions over here. So he says that if the aspiring transcendentalist is able to control the urges, shodham, at the time they arise, iha. So one is nipping it at the bud. The second he says is that if despite the endeavor to control, there are still disturbances coming from lust and anger, then the person should tolerate it. Vegam. Right? So if the person is able to do both of these, then he is well situated and is happy in this life. Sa yukta sa sukhi naraha. Now if you remember, this instruction is very similar to one of the first instructions that Krishna gives to Arjuna in 2:14, where he says matra sparshastu konteya, and then he says tam titikshasva bharata, that one must simply learn to tolerate them without being disturbed. So there Krishna just gave the instruction as an imperative that do this. Here Krishna is now elaborating the process. How can one control the urges as they rise and tolerate them when they manifest? So the process that Krishna has given now is that one goes through sakam karma, nishkam karma. Through nishkam karma one develops atma gyan. From the platform of atma gyan one develops affection for Paramatma. And when the person is at this stage, then he is able to do this. He is able to control the urges as they arise, and for those that he is not able to control, he is able to tolerate the agitation, vegam, right? And such a person, even though externally he is in the ocean of samsara, he is in the ocean of material miseries, he is yukta. Yukta means that he is unaffected, he is a yogi, and he alone is happy. Okay, next verse. Verse 24. Yanta sukontarararam stanthantar jyotireva sa yogi brahma nirvanam brahma bhuto digacchati. One whose happiness is within, who is active and rejoices within, and whose aim is inward, is actually the perfect mystic. He is liberated in the Supreme, and ultimately he attains the Supreme. So this verse is talking about one who has transcended the samsara, the material existence, and attains the realization of the state of Brahman. So what are some of the symptoms? That his happiness is in the soul, antara, because he enjoys in the soul. So he is not dependent on anything external. Right? So this is the nature of an Atmaram. An Atmaram is one who is Atma is self, and Ram is Ramyate, who is happy in the self. And because of that happiness, he directs his vision to the soul. So it says Antarjyoti, and attains the happiness of Brahman. So again, the point that we want to mention here is the symptoms that are being described over here is that of a Brahmavadi. But Krishna is loosely using the two terms. At some point he talks about the Paramatmavadi, right, when he talks about one who is drawing pleasure. Because the happiness of Brahman is a little different from the happiness of Paramatma. The happiness of Brahman is absence of misery, is the state of neutrality. And the happiness of Paramatma is actually experiencing the bliss of relating with the Supreme Lord. So they're a little different, but Krishna is using them more or less interchangeably because they sit right next to one another. We already saw that one who has Atma realization soon moves on to Paramatma realization. And another reason, of course, is that the next verse will talk mostly about Paramatma realization. So Krishna is, so to speak, transitioning from Atma to Paramatma. So he is talking about both interchangeably. If you look at the word in the verse, it says Adhigachati. So Adhigachati means ultimately attains. And Prabhupada translates it this way to show that this path is long and arduous, and the destination is not assured. Because first there is karma, sakam karma, pious activities, possibility of falling down there, nishkam karma, possibility of falling down there, atma gyan, paramatma gyan. So every stage one has to be constantly purifying themselves, depending on the self to stay on the path, and setbacks are there. We see that in the lives of great sages, that for a while they make advancement, something causes a setback, then either opposite sex or anger or something, and then they try again. So there's a step forward, step back. So that's where Srila Prabhupada says Adhigachati means ultimately attains. That it's not a straightforward, direct process. And Srila Prabhupada, of course, is doing this to set the stage for the future glorification of bhakti, which is more of a simple, straightforward process. Okay, next verse. Okay, verse 25. Labante brahma nirvanam rishih kshina kalmashaha Chinnadveda yatatmana sarvabhuta hiterata. Those who are beyond the dualities that arise from doubts, whose minds are engaged within, who are always busy working for the welfare of all living beings, and who are free from all sins, achieve liberation in the Supreme. So, more symptoms of one who is seeking spiritual satisfaction, right? So, the doubts are pacified by spiritual knowledge, right? So kshina kalmasha. Kshina kalmasha is the second symptom, which is they're free from sinful activities. Third is equanimity, that they are beyond the dualities. And fourth is that they work for the welfare of others. Now this fourth quality, that they work for the welfare of others, sarva bhuta hite rataha, is a characteristic of Paramatma realization. Right? The first three are more characteristic of Atma Gyan. That they're well established in the spiritual knowledge of the self, because they are detached from the material conception. They're also detached from the dualities, and faith in the scriptures, so they do not engage in sinful activities. So these are qualities of Atma Gyan. And then the fourth one, that they're constantly engaged in the welfare activities of the other, is a quality of Paramatma vision. And Prabhupada explains that if you take this to the next step, then what is the ultimate welfare of the others? Which is also giving them spiritual knowledge. And that essentially is Krishna consciousness. So Prabhupada connects this to the next stage, that at a Paramatma vision, one is favorable to others, working for their welfare, but as a devotee, they are working for their ultimate welfare, which is getting them out of this samsara, getting them out of this cycle of material birth and rebirth. So Prabhupada writes in the purport that a person engaged only in ministering to the physical welfare of human society cannot factually help anyone. So here Prabhupada is talking about those who are even one step below, who are basically charitable people who are engaged in charity activities, humanitarian welfare. Well, these activities are good, they're in the mode of goodness, but Prabhupada says it's temporary relief of the external body. Because at different time he uses different analogies, like blowing on the boil, that if you have a boil that is painful on the skin, and if you blow on it, you get temporary relief, but the boil still remains. As soon as you stop blowing, it starts hurting again. At the time he would talk about how a drowning person is trying to help another drowning person. Both of them are caught in this ocean of samsara, and for temporarily they may be able to prop another person up, but ultimately both are drowning. So when a person is fully conscious of his relationship with Krishna, then he is actually a liberated soul, although he may be in a material tabernacle. Prabhupada uses this word, it's Old English word. Tabernacle essentially means it essentially means unwanted things. Tabernacle means collection of garbage, collection of old things that are unused. So entanglement. So the potency of Krishna consciousness is that since one is aspiring to help others while helping oneself in an ultimate way, which is getting out of this material cycle of birth and death, even though the person may be still materially entangled, then he is still working for the ultimate welfare of everyone else. Okay, let's go to the next verse. Verse 26. Kama krodha vimuktanam yatinam yata chetesham avito brahma nirvanam vartate viditatmanam. Those who are free from anger and all material desires, who are self-realized, self-disciplined, and constantly endeavoring for perfection, are assured of liberation in the Supreme in the very near future. So, this verse explains that through this process of sadhana that Krishna has given, and he gives a brief summary of it: self-realized, self-disciplined, free from anger, free from material desires. So this is essentially a summation of the process of Atma Gyan, Paramatma Gyan, that they're controlling the mind and senses. Self-discipline means they're following the scriptures, constantly endeavoring for perfection, constantly endeavoring for spiritual attachments. They are assured of liberation in the Supreme in the very near, almost immediately. So near future, it's a little bit in contradiction to the last two verses, where Krishna had said that they will ultimately reach it, which is after a long effort, or after a lot of effort, 24, 25 verse, previous two verses. So two ways to understand this. One is, this is Krishna being encouraging. So this is obviously a path that Krishna has given, of following karma to Gyan, and through Gyan, perfection. And there are people who take to it. So while Krishna is giving fair warning, he is also encouraging. He is saying it's a path that is long, but you will also attain success. So one can look at it from that perspective. Krishna also wants to encourage those who, because of their own propensity, want to take to this path. Second way is that the near future means that after having realized the soul and Paramatma, right? So what does Krishna says that vartate vidit atmana. So one who has already realized the Atma and Paramatma, they quickly attain the happiness of Brahma Nirvana. Now the path to attain the Atma and Paramatma may be long and arduous, but having attained that, the next stage is quick. Next stage happens quickly, that they attain Brahma Nirvana, which is being in the platform of Brahma Bhuta. That they are in the path of spiritual happiness. Srila Prabhupada explains in the purport that one may question that how can a jiva that has no direct experience of Paramatma be able to develop affection for the super soul? Because while in the material world, you are completely engrossed and encompassed by the material conception, and the scriptures are asking you to do something beyond that. So Srila Prabhupada explains that by quoting a verse that comes up in a conversation between Krishna and Lord Brahma, wherein Krishna says that by vision, by meditation, and by touch only do the fish, the tortoise, and the birds maintain their offsprings. Similarly, do I also, O Padmaja. Right? So Krishna talks about three ways that a fish will bring up its offspring by looking at it, by vision. The tortoise will bring up its offspring by meditating. So the tortoise goes to the land, to the shore, and lays the eggs, and then goes back into the water, but then it meditates on it. And the birds, they will actually sit on their egg. So by actual physical touch, they will nourish the eggs. So similarly, Krishna says, so do I. So Krishna is saying, I am also accessible by these three ways: by vision, meditation, and by touch. And this is specifically in the context of deity worship. That by vision, one can see the deities. One can dress the deities, one can worship the deities by touch, and one can meditate on the deities also. So with this, Krishna completes his explanation of how to achieve liberation through the knowledge of the super soul. In the next two verses, he will talk about the subsequent ways to connect to the super soul. which is by Astang Yoga. So from karma to Gyan, and from Gyan to Astang. So the next two verses essentially will be a summation of what will appear in the 6th chapter. Okay, so let's move on to the next verse. Okay, verses 27, 28. Sparshan kritva bahirmayans chakshus chaivantare bhruvuhu pranapano samau kritva nashabhayantra charinau yatendriya mano buddhir munir moksha parayana vigate cha bhaya krodho yah sada mukta eva saha. Shutting out all external sense objects, keeping the eyes and vision concentrated between the two eyebrows, suspending the inward and outward breaths within the nostrils, and thus controlling the mind, senses, and intelligence, the transcendentalist, aiming at liberation, becomes free from desire, fear, and anger. One who is always in this state is certainly liberated. So as I mentioned, this verse is a segue into Astang Yoga. Now, the interesting thing in this verse is that what Krishna states as the result is also the prerequisite. So in the first few lines, he talks about keeping the eyes and vision concentrated, the inward outward breaths. That's all Astanga Yoga, right? And then he says, thus controlling the mind, senses, and intelligence, the transcendentalist becomes free from desire, fear, and anger. So it might appear that this is the result of Astanga Yoga, but actually this is the prerequisite of it. And this we know because Krishna himself has walked us through the process. So what has he explained so far? That by the performance of Nishkam Karma, one's heart is purified. So then arises the Atma Gyan, right? Tvam, in the verse, the knowledge of the soul. From the knowledge of the soul, the subsequent knowledge is that of the doers. Between the soul, the modes of material nature, and comes the third doer, Paramatma. So, Tat, then the one begins to gain knowledge of the super soul. And the knowledge for the super soul becomes automatically tinged with affection for the super soul. Right? So this we know is the initial stages of bhakti, Mishra Bhakti. When this appears, one gains realization of the Brahman. So in these three verses, 27 to 29, Krishna is now going to explain the subsequent activities. Right? So the prerequisite is sparshan bhayan, that the external through, so sparshan means contact, bhayan means external. So external contact, which means external senses, one gives up in the form of sound, touch, etc. And one withdraws, bahiskritya. Right? So one withdraws from the external, and thus one attains Gyan. And what does the person do after having attained Atma and Paramatma Gyan? That is the summation of Astanga Yoga. So Krishna says the eye should be focused between the brows, between the eyebrows. Why? Because if you completely close the eyes, the mind becomes inactive and one goes to sleep. If the eyes are completely open, then they tend to be distracted. That there may be a bird that might come and sit, or there may be animals frolicking around. So in order to prevent both sleep and wandering of the senses, one keeps the eyes half closed, focused between the eyebrows. And the next is that the control of breathing, pran and apan. So by this, one becomes more fixed on the Supreme Lord. So such a person whose only goal is moksha parayana, whose only goal is to take surrender of liberation, becomes steady on the path of liberation. Okay. So next verse is the last verse of the chapter. Verse 29. Bhoktaram yagatapasama sarvaloka maheshwaram surdam sarvabhutanam gyatva mam shantim racchati. A person in full consciousness of me, knowing me to be the ultimate beneficiary of all sacrifices and austerities, the Supreme Lord of all planets and demigods, and the benefactor and well-wisher of all living entities, attains peace from the pangs of material desires. Verse 29. Bhoktaram yagatapasama sarvaloka maheshwaram Surdam sarvabhutanam gyatva mam shantim racchati. A person in full consciousness of me, knowing me to be the ultimate beneficiary of all sacrifices and austerities, the Supreme Lord of all planets and demigods, and the benefactor and well-wisher of all living entities, attains peace from the pangs of material miseries. So this concluding verse kind of gives an summation of where we are from the beginning of Bhagavad-gita. So Krishna here presents himself as the goal for all the aspiring transcendentalists. So Krishna in this 5 chapters has presented different paths to access him. And here he is saying that he is the goal of all the paths. So he says that Bhuktaram Yaga Tapasama. So this is the Karma Yogis, the Karma Kandis, who perform Yajna for material benefits. And Krishna says, I am the Bhuktaram, I am the enjoyers of that. And then also he says, he is the Bhuktaram of Yaga Tapasama. So Tapasama is the austerities of self-control. So Krishna says, I am the goal of that too. And then he says, I am Sarvaloka Maheshwaram. So who is the great controller of all living entities? Paramatma. So he says, as Paramatma, I am the object of worship of the Astang Yogis. And then he says that I am the well-wisher of all living entities. Surdam Sarva Bhutana. So this is Krishna as Swayam Bhagwan. This is Krishna who, as a way to benefit all the living entities, gives them instructions about bhakti through the medium of his devotees. So when one understands this, Shantim Rachati, right? So when one understands that all these are going to the same destination, Krishna, then one attains peace from the pangs of material existence. So one cannot make any kind of spiritual advancement without acknowledging the presence of Krishna. So whether the person is Karmakandi, Gyan, Astang, unless the person understands that all this is coming from Krishna, the person cannot attain any spiritual maturity. So in this verse, Krishna is trying to bring everything together. That even though there are several paths, they're all paths that are ultimately leading to him. And the reason there are different paths is because people have different propensities. But important for all of them to acknowledge is the presence of Krishna, and that is the only way that one will get peace, Shantim rachati. Okay, so with this we end the 5th chapter, in which Krishna explained that how by the performance of Nishkam Karma Yoga, the Jnani makes advancements. He realizes Atma, then realizes Paramatma, and then reaches to the more mature stage of Astang Yoga, which will be the topic of the next chapter. So we'll end over here. Srila Prabhupada ki Jai.